Picture this. You come home to find your grandfather's lakeside cabin, the one he built with his own hands in 1956, now occupied by some unemployed 28-year-old and his girlfriend who smirk at you from your front porch and say, "Sorry, this is ours now." The HOA president sold it to her own son for $24,000 because of unpaid dues you never owed. My grandfather's Purple Heart photos, in the dumpster, his handmade furniture, gone. The smell of their greasy takeout was coming from his kitchen while the rough cardboard boxes holding 60 years of memories sat soggy in the rain. When I called the cops, they told me to leave. But what this power-hungry HOA Karen didn't know was that my grandfather had worked for the FBI for 35 years, and that cabin was still technically federal property. What would you do if you found strangers living in your family's cabin? Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I bet some of you have HOA horror stories too. Let me back up and tell you how this nightmare started. 3 years ago, I inherited my grandfather's cabin from my mom's side. Walter Kowalski, Korean War veteran who came home in 1953 and decided he'd had enough of people telling him what to do. So he bought 5 acres of pristine lakefront property for $800 and built his dream cabin with nothing but hand tools and pure stubbornness. The place was magic. You could smell the pine sap still weeping from logs he'd cut himself, hear the gentle lapping of Mirror Lake against the dock he'd built, and feel the smooth stones of the fireplace he'd mortared by hand. Worth about 400 grand now, but to me, priceless. The rough texture of those hand-hewn logs told the story of a man who'd earned his peace. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The cabin sat technically within the boundaries of the Whispering Pines HOA, but it predated their existence by 40 years. When they incorporated in 1996, Grandpa's property was grandfathered in. Should have been untouchable. Enter Margaret Thornfield, and yes, that's her real name because this story's going public. Picture your worst nightmare of a HOA president. Perfectly styled silver hair, voice that could cut glass, and the kind of smile that made small children hide behind their mothers. She'd been running that HOA like her personal kingdom for 12 years, and she had a very specific hunting pattern. Margaret targeted inherited properties, especially from military families and anyone with a foreign-sounding name. Why? Because we're often out of state, dealing with family emergencies, and don't have time to fight lengthy legal battles. She was like a vulture circling wounded prey, but with better manicures. Her day job, real estate agent, naturally. The woman knew exactly how to weaponize the system against families who didn't belong in her precious neighborhood. Her son Bradley was 30% criminal, 70% mama's boy, 28 years old, unemployed, and living in his childhood bedroom with a rap sheet that included petty theft, drug possession, and intimidating witnesses. The kind of guy who'd borrow your lawnmower and sell it on Facebook Marketplace, then show up asking why you're being weird about it. Margaret had been trying to get him his own place for years, but who's going to rent to someone whose last job was freelance pharmaceutical distribution? The first shot across my bow came while I was in Ohio, helping my mom recover from hip surgery. A certified letter arrived at the cabin. You know that crisp, official sound when you tear open those envelopes? The musty smell of legal documents mixed with Margaret's flowery perfume hit me like a slap. Inside was a bill for $15,000 in retroactive landscaping assessments for improvements I'd never requested, never approved, and honestly never even seen. She demanded payment within 30 days or face a lien on the property. 30 days for landscaping that allegedly happened before I even inherited the place. The bitter taste of morning coffee became permanently associated with reading her harassment letters. But Margaret was just getting started. Every single day, I'd find new violation notices tucked under my door. Grass too long, citation. Mailbox the wrong shade of black, citation. Suspicious late-night activity, citation. The woman had apparently appointed herself as my personal surveillance system, with a special focus on finding reasons why the Kowalski property was incompatible with community standards. She'd even convinced the local utility company to block my driveway during emergency tree trimming, which coincidentally happened every time I had guests over, especially my army buddies who'd drive up in their pickup trucks. Then came the neighbors. Margaret had this gift for turning people against each other. She'd knock on doors, clipboard in hand, asking folks to sign complaints about the disruptive military veteran who was probably suffering from PTSD, and letting the property values decline. The whispers started, the friendly waves stopped, and suddenly I felt like a stranger in my own grandfather's neighborhood. Margaret was building a case, piece by piece, citation by citation. She was patient, methodical, and absolutely ruthless. What I didn't realize was that she'd been planning this particular property grab for a very long time, and it had nothing to do with HOA rules and everything to do with a 40-year-old grudge that was about to explode into the open. 3 weeks after that first threatening letter, Margaret made her next move, and it was a doozy. She filed a lien against my property for $23,000 in accumulated fees, fines, and interest. Not $15,000 anymore, $23,000. Apparently, my failure to pay the original bogus bill had triggered penalty clauses that would make a loan shark blush. The paperwork arrived on a Tuesday morning, and I'll never forget the sound of that process server's boots crunching across my gravel driveway. Margaret had used her connections at the county clerk's office to expedite the whole thing. Turns out when you've been selling real estate for 20 years, you know exactly which palms to grease and which forms to file in what order. But here's where it gets really sick. She'd scheduled a sheriff's sale for 30 days out. Sheriff's sale, like I was some deadbeat who'd abandoned the property. The woman was literally trying to steal my grandfather's cabin through legal manipulation, and she was doing it with a smile. Now, I may have been born at night, but it wasn't last night. I spent the next week digging through public records, and what I found made my blood boil. Over the past 5 years, Margaret had sold 3 HOA properties to her relatives at suspiciously low prices. Her brother-in-law bought a lakefront lot worth $200,000 for $60,000. Her nephew scored a corner property for half its assessed value. The woman was running the HOA like her personal real estate empire. So I fired my first shot back. I contacted the State Real Estate Commission with a formal complaint, complete with transaction records, HOA meeting minutes, and a timeline that would make a prosecutor weep with joy. Conflict of interest doesn't even begin to cover it. This was straight-up corruption. The complaint cited specific violations: failing to disclose financial interest in HOA decisions, using inside information for personal gain, and manipulating property values through selective enforcement. I felt like David loading his slingshot, but Margaret didn't get to be HOA queen by rolling over when someone fought back. Within 48 hours of my complaint being filed, she called an emergency HOA board meeting and somehow moved my sheriff's sale up to 2 weeks. 2 weeks! Her justification? I was actively destroying property values with my frivolous legal complaints and posed an immediate threat to community stability. The smell of her desperation was almost as strong as her perfume. She knew I was onto her scheme, and she was accelerating the timeline before I could build a proper defense. It was like watching someone try to rob a bank while the alarm was already going off. She rallied the HOA board, all 4 of them, including her hairdresser and the guy who runs the bait shop, to support emergency action against the disruptive military veteran who was clearly unstable and probably dangerous. The minutes from that meeting read like a script from a bad soap opera. Here's something most people don't know. HOA liens can only be placed after a formal hearing where the homeowner has the right to dispute the charges. Margaret had skipped this step entirely, gambling that I wouldn't know my rights or have the resources to fight back. Always demand proof of proper legal procedure before accepting any lien notice. Meanwhile, I was learning more about Margaret's operation than I ever wanted to know. She had a whole system: target inherited properties, especially from out-of-state heirs, flood them with violations and fees, then swoop in when they couldn't fight back. She'd done this dance before, and she was good at it. The really sick part? She'd been watching my grandfather's property for years, just waiting for him to die so she could make her move. Neighbors later told me she'd actually asked about his health during HOA meetings, like she was tracking a stock price. But Margaret had made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just another overwhelmed heir who'd fold under pressure. She didn't do her homework about who she was really dealing with. My grandfather hadn't just been any veteran. He'd been the kind of man who taught me that when someone tries to steal from you, you don't just roll over and take it. I spent that week preparing for war. Every document copied, every conversation recorded, every neighbor interviewed. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, I was about to show her what a real fight looked like. The gravel in my driveway would soon be crunching under the boots of people she definitely didn't want to meet. Because here's the thing about military families. We don't just have each other's backs. We have long memories, powerful friends, and absolutely zero tolerance for bullies who think they can steamroll us with paperwork and legal threats. Margaret was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 2 weeks later, Margaret pulled off what I can only describe as the most brazen theft I've ever witnessed. The sheriff's sale was scheduled for 10 a.m. on a Thursday, but here's the kicker. She made sure only her cronies knew about it. See, legal notices are supposed to be published in the local newspaper for public awareness. Margaret's version ran in the classified section of some tiny weekly paper that nobody reads, sandwiched between ads for used farm equipment and a psychic hotline. The notice was so buried you'd need a treasure map to find it. But her inner circle? They knew exactly when and where. At 9:58 a.m., I watched from across the street as exactly 3 people showed up for my public auction. Margaret herself, some guy in a cheap suit who smelled like cigarettes and failure, and Bradley, looking like he'd just rolled out of bed. The bidding was a joke. Cheap suit guy opened with $20,000. Margaret's little prince countered with $24,000, suspiciously precise, like he'd done the math ahead of time. Then nothing. Silence. The auctioneer looked around for about 30 seconds before declaring Bradley the proud new owner of my family's cabin. $24,000 for a property worth $400,000. It was like watching someone buy a Lamborghini for the price of a used bicycle. Within an hour, Bradley and his girlfriend, a charming woman with face tattoos and a voice like a rusty chainsaw, were moving their belongings into my cabin. I'm talking trash bags full of clothes, a collection of energy drink cans that could fill a recycling center, and what appeared to be a stolen shopping cart they were using as a furniture dolly. That's when I knew I needed serious legal firepower. I hired Rebecca Martinez, an attorney who specialized in HOA law and had a reputation for eating corrupt board members for breakfast. Her first move was brilliant. She discovered that the sale notice hadn't been properly published according to state law. Turns out, there are very specific requirements for sheriff's sale notifications. They have to run in the paper with the largest circulation in the county, not some backwoods weekly that Margaret's cousin probably owns. The whole sale was legally invalid. Rebecca filed an emergency injunction to stop any eviction proceedings, and for about 24 hours, I thought we had Margaret cornered. That's when she pulled out what she thought was her smoking gun. A manila envelope arrived by courier, because apparently Margaret watches too many legal dramas, containing a document that made my heart sink into my boots. It was a HOA agreement, dated 1987, with what appeared to be my grandfather's signature agreeing to full compliance with all current and future HOA regulations and fee assessments. 1987. 31 years after Grandpa built the cabin, and supposedly 24 years before he died. The document looked legitimate, complete with a notary seal and everything. Margaret had somehow produced proof that my grandfather had voluntarily joined her HOA. The judge took one look at that document and granted a temporary restraining order against me. I was officially banned from approaching my own property while the court investigated the conflicting claims. Bradley waved at me from my grandfather's front porch, a beer in one hand and a middle finger in the other. Document authentication is trickier than you think. Even notarized papers can be fraudulent if the notary didn't properly verify identity or the signer was coerced. Always request original documents and verify notary credentials through the state database. But something about that 1987 agreement smelled fishier than last week's salmon. For starters, my grandfather was the most anti-authority person I'd ever known. The man who'd rather live off-grid than deal with utility companies was going to voluntarily sign up for HOA harassment? Right. Plus, the paper looked too clean for a 30-year-old document. No yellowing, no creases, no coffee stains. My grandfather couldn't sign his name without spilling something on the paperwork first. It was like a superpower he had. I started making calls to every neighbor who'd known Grandpa, asking about 1987. What I found was interesting. Nobody remembered him ever attending HOA meetings, getting violation notices, or paying any fees. For someone who'd allegedly joined their association, he'd been remarkably invisible. Margaret, meanwhile, was practically doing victory laps around the neighborhood. She'd drive past the cabin slowly, windows down, that satisfied smirk plastered across her face like she'd just won the lottery. Her son was living in my family's home, and there wasn't a damn thing I could legally do about it. But Margaret had made a critical error. She'd gotten cocky, and cocky people make mistakes. She didn't know that I'd started recording every conversation, documenting every interaction, and building a case that would make her wish she'd never heard the name Kowalski. The real war was just beginning. Margaret's next move was so low it made her previous stunts look like gentle pranks. She decided to go nuclear and try to destroy my reputation in the community. Within a week of getting that restraining order, She filed not one, not two, but 5 separate police reports claiming I was stalking her family. According to Margaret's creative fiction, I was lurking around her house at night, following her to the grocery store and making threatening gestures whenever she drove past the cabin. The woman had apparently missed her calling as a screenwriter because these stories were pure Hollywood. But here's the sick genius of it. She knew that veterans often get painted with the unstable PTSD brush, and she was playing that card like a poker pro. She even managed to get a restraining order that prevented me from coming within 500 feet of the cabin. 500 feet. I couldn't even drive past my own family's property without risking arrest. The whispers around town got louder. Did you hear about that military guy? Margaret says he's been making threats. Maybe we should be worried about our safety. It was character assassination, pure and simple, and it was working. But 2 can play the community organizing game. I called an informal meeting at Murphy's Diner, that kind of small-town place where the coffee tastes like it was brewed during the Clinton administration, but the pie makes up for it. I figured if I was going to clear my name, I needed to do it face-to-face with real people. What I discovered that night changed everything. Margaret's reign of terror wasn't limited to just me. 4 other families had similar horror stories. The Hendersons lost their deck because of structural violations that mysteriously appeared after they complained about Margaret's landscaping choices. The Patels got hit with thousands in fines for cultural decorations that were inconsistent with community standards, also known as the beautiful prayer flags in their garden. Then there was old Mr. Peterson, whose crime was installing a wheelchair ramp for his wife without HOA approval. Margaret had actually tried to force an 80-year-old man to tear down accessibility equipment. The smell of her moral bankruptcy was stronger than Murphy's overcooked hash browns. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Someone slipped me an envelope as I was leaving the diner. No signature, just a note that said, "You might find this interesting." Inside was a copy of Bradley's probation paperwork showing that he was required to maintain a registered address with his probation officer. Guess what address Bradley had registered? His mother's house, not my grandfather's cabin. By moving into the property, he'd violated his probation requirements, and his probation officer had no idea where he actually was. The kid wasn't just a squatter. He was now a fugitive. I called Bradley's probation officer the next morning, and let me tell you, Officer Williams was not pleased to learn that his parolee had gone AWOL. Apparently, Bradley had missed his last 2 check-ins, claiming he was house-sitting for a sick relative. Technically true, if you consider theft a form of house-sitting. Restraining orders based on false reports are surprisingly common. The good news? Filing a false police report is a felony, and courts hate being deceived. Document everything with timestamps and witnesses. False accusers often contradict themselves. But Margaret wasn't done with her smear campaign. She started showing up at local businesses, warning them about the dangerous veteran who was clearly having a mental breakdown. She told the hardware store owner that I'd threatened to burn everything down. She warned the gas station attendant that I might be armed and unstable. The amazing thing was watching her perform these character assassinations. She had this way of lowering her voice and looking over her shoulder, like she was sharing state secrets. I'm probably not supposed to tell you this, but... And then she'd launch into another creative interpretation of reality. Meanwhile, I was building my own network. Every veteran in a 50-mile radius started hearing about Margaret's tactics, and let me tell you, we take care of our own. When word got out that some HOA queen was trying to steal a Korean War veteran's property and smear his grandson, phones started ringing. The American Legion post commander, a Vietnam vet named Frank, who could probably bench press a Buick, started making his own calls. The VFW Ladies Auxiliary, led by a fierce woman named Betty who'd served 3 tours as an Army nurse, began their own investigation into Margaret's background. And here's what they found. Margaret's father had lost a property dispute to my grandfather back in the 80s. Suddenly, her obsession with my family's land made perfect sense. This wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. This was about a 40-year-old grudge that had been festering like an infected wound. Margaret thought she was fighting one isolated veteran. She was about to discover she'd declared war on an entire brotherhood. While sorting through my grandfather's belongings that Bradley had so graciously thrown in the dumpster, I found something that changed everything. Buried in a waterlogged cardboard box, underneath his Purple Heart citation and some old fishing licenses, was a manila folder marked Official Correspondence, FBI. My hands were actually shaking as I opened it. Inside were letters dating from 1960 to 1995, all on official FBI letterhead, all addressed to my grandfather. But these weren't the kind of FBI letters you'd expect. These were thank you notes, payment vouchers, and meeting schedules for something called Civilian Asset Program. Turns out my quiet grandfather, who just liked his privacy, had been working as a civilian contractor for the FBI for 35 years. The cabin wasn't just his retirement home. It had been used as an off-site meeting location for federal agents conducting surveillance operations on organized crime figures who frequented the area's casinos and hunting lodges. One letter, dated 1987, the same year as Margaret's mysterious HOA agreement, was particularly interesting. It was from Special Agent Sarah Patterson, thanking Walter for continued use of secure facilities and confirming that the property would maintain federal protection status for operational security purposes. Federal protection status. Those three words hit me like a lightning bolt. I called the FBI field office in Detroit, half expecting to be laughed off the phone, but when I mentioned Agent Patterson's name and my grandfather's civilian contractor number, suddenly I was being transferred to supervisory agents and asked to hold for verification procedures. 20 minutes later, Agent Patterson herself called me back. She was retired now, but she remembered my grandfather fondly. Walter was one of our most reliable assets, she said. That cabin of his was perfect for our needs, isolated, secure, and completely off everyone's radar. Then came the bombshell that made my day, my week, and probably my entire year. The property still has an inactive federal easement for national security purposes. Has someone been interfering with federal property? Federal easements trump local HOA authority every single time. It's like bringing a tank to a knife fight. Agent Patterson explained that while the easement was inactive, it had never been officially terminated. The FBI maintained a legal claim on the property that superseded any local jurisdiction, including HOA authority. Margaret's entire legal strategy, the liens, the sheriff's sale, all of it, was about as valid as a $3 bill. But the best part? That 1987 HOA agreement that Margaret was so proud of? The same year the FBI renewed their operational security agreement with my grandfather. There was no way in hell he would have voluntarily joined an HOA while hosting federal agents for classified meetings. Agent Patterson agreed to meet me the next day to review the documents and assess potential interference with federal interests. She also mentioned that the Bureau took a dim view of people who harass the families of their civilian assets, especially when those families were military veterans. I spent that night reading through 35 years of correspondence between my grandfather and the FBI, and a picture emerged of a man I'd never really known. He wasn't just a veteran who wanted to be left alone. He was someone who'd continued serving his country in secret, providing a safe house for federal agents when they needed it most. The cabin had been so much more than a family retreat. It had been a piece of American intelligence history, and Margaret had been trying to steal it so her deadbeat son could have a place to smoke weed and play video games. Tomorrow, Agent Patterson would officially confirm what I already knew. Margaret had picked the wrong property and the wrong family to mess with. The federal government was about to enter the chat, and HOA Karens don't typically fare well against the FBI. The next morning, Agent Patterson arrived at Murphy's Diner in a black SUV that probably cost more than most people's houses. She was exactly what you'd expect from a 30-year FBI veteran. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, and the kind of presence that made every conversation in the diner suddenly drop to whispers. Over coffee that could strip paint, I spread out my grandfather's documents while she reviewed everything with the methodical precision of someone who'd built careers on details. "Your grandfather was a patriot," she said, examining a 1982 surveillance report. "We used his cabin for operations targeting the Torino crime family. Some very dangerous people never knew how close we were to them." She made a phone call that lasted exactly 3 minutes, and when she hung up, she had that satisfied look of someone who'd just activated a very powerful machine. "The Bureau is officially reopening interest in this property. We'll be conducting a full investigation into any interference with federal assets. My first ally secured, but I needed more firepower. Rebecca Martinez, my HOA attorney, was already building the legal strategy. She'd found 17 procedural violations in Margaret's lien process, from improper notice to fraudulent documentation. But Rebecca's real genius was in finding the pattern. "Margaret's done this before," she explained, spreading out property records across her conference table. "She targets inherited properties, floods them with violations, then either forces a sale or buys them herself through shell companies. It's a systematic operation." Rebecca had identified 6 properties over the past decade where Margaret had pulled similar stunts. The total value? Over $2 million in property that had changed hands under suspicious circumstances. We weren't just fighting for my cabin, we were exposing a criminal enterprise. Our third ally came from an unexpected source. Daniel Kim, an investigative reporter from the regional newspaper, had been quietly documenting HOA corruption across the state. When he heard about a case involving FBI property, he practically drooled with excitement. "This is the story I've been waiting for," he said, his notebook already filling with details. "HOA corruption plus federal property plus military family harassment. This has Pulitzer potential." Daniel brought something we desperately needed: media strategy. He'd coordinate with local news outlets to ensure maximum coverage when we made our move. Margaret's weapon of choice was public opinion. We were about to turn it against her. But our most powerful allies were the neighbors Margaret had been terrorizing for years. Frank from the American Legion organized what he called a reconnaissance meeting at the VFW Hall. 23 families showed up, each with their own horror story about Margaret's reign of terror. Public records requests are your best friend. HOAs must disclose all financial transactions. The Henderson family brought receipts showing they'd paid over $8,000 in frivolous fines. The Patels had documentation of Margaret's discriminatory enforcement, their cultural decorations violations, while similar items in other yards went unnoticed. Old Mr. Peterson had photos of Margaret literally measuring his wheelchair ramp with a ruler, looking for violations. But the real treasure came from Betty, the VFW auxiliary president who'd done some digging of her own. She'd filed a public records request for all HOA financial transactions over the past 5 years. What she found was beautiful in its simplicity. Margaret had been systematically embezzling money. The HOA's landscaping budget showed payments to Thornfield Property Services, a company owned by Margaret's brother. Security system upgrades billed to Bradley's Electronics, a business that existed only on paper. Even the legal fees were inflated, with Margaret billing the HOA for personal attorney consultations. Security cameras on your own property are legal in all 50 states, regardless of HOA rules. Our strategy crystallized around 3 fronts: legal, federal, and public relations. Rebecca would handle the courts, challenging every aspect of Margaret's property grab. Agent Patterson would coordinate the FBI investigation into interference with federal property. Daniel would document everything for maximum media impact. Meanwhile, I'd been quietly installing security cameras around the property perimeter, perfectly legal on federal easement land. Every violation notice Margaret posted, every time Bradley vandalized something, every visit from her enablers was now being recorded in high definition. Federal property easements are searchable through the Bureau of Land Management database. The beauty of our plan was its simplicity. Margaret had built her power on secrets, intimidation, and legal confusion. We were about to drag everything into the light. Every fraudulent document, every embezzled dollar, every abuse of power would be exposed for the entire community to see. Agent Patterson ran background checks on Margaret and Bradley that revealed federal tax liens, unreported income, and Bradley's probation violations. Rebecca compiled evidence of systemic HOA fraud that would make any prosecutor's eyes light up. Daniel prepared media packages that would turn Margaret from neighborhood queen into public enemy number 1. Margaret thought she was fighting one isolated veteran. She was about to face the combined force of the FBI, federal courts, and an entire community that was sick of her bullying. The hunter was about to become the hunted. Margaret's desperation was starting to show, and desperate people do stupid things. Within a week of Agent Patterson's visit to the diner, Margaret hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me. Not just any PI, she went with Rex Bulldozer Korvinsky, a bottom feeder who specialized in insurance fraud cases and probably learned his investigative techniques from watching old episodes of Magnum PI. Rex was about as subtle as a sledgehammer in a china shop. Neighbors started calling to tell me about the guy in the beat-up Camaro who was asking questions about my mental stability and history of violence. He'd sit outside Murphy's diner with a telephoto lens, taking pictures of me drinking coffee like I was plotting international terrorism. The smell of his desperation was stronger than the cigarettes he chain-smoked while conducting his surveillance. This was Margaret's brilliant strategy: hire a discount detective to prove that the dangerous veteran was actually dangerous. It would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. But Margaret's real masterstroke came when she tried to bribe the county clerk to backdate some HOA formation documents. She needed to prove that her association had authority over my property before 1956, which was about as likely as finding unicorns in the courthouse parking lot. The clerk, bless his honest heart, recorded the entire conversation and turned it over to the district attorney's office. Margaret had offered him $5,000 to discover some misfiled paperwork that would strengthen her case. The recording was crystal clear, complete with Margaret's voice saying, "This little problem could just disappear if you knew where to look." Meanwhile, the FBI investigation was picking up steam in ways that made my week considerably brighter. Agent Patterson had assigned a junior agent named Martinez, no relation to my attorney, to review all federal property records in the county. What they found was fascinating. Margaret had been systematically researching federal properties for years, looking for inactive easements she could challenge. She'd targeted 3 other properties with federal connections, but backed off when the owners hired expensive lawyers. My grandfather's cabin was different because she assumed a deceased veteran's grandson wouldn't know about federal protections. Wrong assumption, Margaret. But the real bombshell came when Agent Patterson called with news that made my entire month. The FBI had discovered that Margaret and Bradley weren't just squatting in my cabin, they were using it as a base for Bradley's renewed drug distribution business. Surveillance cameras had captured multiple suspicious transactions, and Bradley's customers included several people on federal watch lists. Federal marshals don't mess around. When they serve papers, local law enforcement has to step back. Federal jurisdiction supersedes everything. Margaret's response to the federal investigation was to double down on crazy. She organized an emergency HOA meeting to retroactively change the bylaws, hoping to create new rules that would somehow overcome federal law. It was like watching someone try to repeal gravity through a neighborhood vote. The meeting was held in Margaret's living room, because apparently the community center had suddenly become unavailable. All 4 board members attended: Margaret herself, her hairdresser Linda, bait shop owner Dave, and Margaret's actual brother-in-law Tom. This was the mighty HOA board that was supposed to override federal property rights. They voted unanimously, shocking, to implement emergency powers that would allow the president to override any federal claims on neighborhood properties. They also voted themselves retroactive immunity from any frivolous lawsuits filed by disgruntled former residents. The minutes from this meeting read like a comedy sketch written by people who'd never heard of constitutional law. But Margaret saved her best move for last. She called a press conference, and I use that term very loosely, to announce that the neighborhood was being terrorized by a mentally unstable veteran who claims to work for the FBI. She set up folding chairs in her driveway and invited local media to hear her side of the story. 3 people showed up: a reporter from the Weekly Shopper newspaper, someone who might have been her cousin with a camera phone, and Daniel Kim, who was there to document Margaret's public meltdown for his investigative series. Margaret's performance was spectacular in its awfulness. She claimed I was part of a deep state conspiracy to steal neighborhood properties through fake federal claims. She produced photocopied documents that allegedly proved my grandfather was a communist sympathizer who'd infiltrated the FBI. She even suggested that Agent Patterson was my secret girlfriend who was helping me commit fraud. The whole thing was captured on video, including the moment when Margaret noticed Daniel Kim recording everything and demanded he stop filming because she hadn't given permission. On a public street, at her own press conference. Never underestimate federal agencies' memory. They keep detailed records going back decades. By the end of that week, Margaret had managed to create federal evidence of bribery, drug facilitation, and defamation. She'd gone from local HOA tyrant to multi-jurisdictional criminal defendant in record time. Margaret's final desperate play was so unhinged, it made her previous antics look like gentle neighborly disagreements. She launched a full-scale smear campaign that would have impressed a political operative, complete with anonymous flyers and a social media blitz designed to paint me as a dangerous, unstable veteran who was threatening the entire community. The flyers started appearing on windshields throughout the neighborhood, featuring my military photo next to headlines like "Dangerous Veteran Threatens Neighbors" and "Is Your Family Safe?" She'd somehow gotten hold of my service record and twisted every commendation into evidence of my violent tendencies. My Bronze Star became proof that I was trained to kill, and my deployment to Afghanistan was evidence that I had unresolved trauma issues. But Margaret's masterpiece was creating a Facebook page called Whispering Pines Safety Alert, where she posted daily updates about my alleged threatening behavior. According to her creative writing, I'd been stalking children at the bus stop, making threatening gestures at elderly residents, and conducting suspicious nighttime activities consistent with terrorist surveillance. The comments section was pure gold, mostly Margaret replying to herself using fake accounts with names like Concerned Mother and Worried Grandpa. She'd apparently forgotten that IP addresses can be traced and that Daniel Kim was screenshot documenting every single post for his investigation. Meanwhile, my real support network was building a counter-narrative that Margaret definitely hadn't seen coming. Agent Patterson had connected me with the FBI's Media Relations Office, who issued an official statement confirming my grandfather's service as a civilian contractor and the continued federal interest in the property. The statement was diplomatic but devastating. The FBI takes seriously any interference with properties that have served national security interests, and we are actively investigating claims of harassment against the families of our civilian assets. Translation: Margaret had picked a fight with the federal government, and they were not amused. Daniel Kim's investigation was turning into the kind of expose that wins journalism awards. He'd traced Margaret's pattern of property targeting back 15 years, uncovered financial irregularities in 6 different HOAs, and discovered connections to a broader network of real estate fraud that stretched across 3 counties. But the real breakthrough came when one of Margaret's previous victims contacted Daniel after seeing his preliminary reporting. Mrs. Chen, an elderly widow whose family had lost their property to Margaret's scheme 5 years earlier, had kept meticulous records of every interaction, every threat, and every legal maneuver. "I knew this day would come," Mrs. Chen told me over tea that tasted like justice and smelled like vindication. "Margaret destroys families, but she always picks the wrong target eventually. I'm just glad it's you who's going to take her down." Mrs. Chen's evidence included recorded phone calls where Margaret explicitly discussed her strategy of targeting foreigners and military types because they don't know how to fight back properly. She'd kept copies of forged documents, fraudulent assessments, and even photos of Margaret's son vandalizing properties to create violation opportunities. Personal vendettas in HOA leadership are more common than you think. That's why many states now require HOA board members to disclose conflicts of interest. The personal vendetta angle became crystal clear when Mrs. Chen showed me property records from 1983. Margaret's father, Harold Thornfield, had tried to buy my grandfather's lakefront property for a fraction of its value, claiming it was landlocked and had no lake access. My grandfather had not only refused to sell, but had helped the county survey department prove that Harold's own property lines were incorrectly marked, costing him 20 feet of shoreline. Harold Thornfield had spent the rest of his life nursing that grudge, and apparently passed it down to his daughter like a toxic family heirloom. Margaret's entire scheme wasn't about HOA rules or community standards. It was about settling a 40-year-old score that had been eating at her family for decades. But Margaret's biggest mistake was underestimating how thoroughly I'd been documenting everything. My security cameras had captured Bradley dealing drugs from my grandfather's front porch, Margaret coaching witnesses before their police statements, and even Rex, the PI, planting evidence in my garbage to discover during his investigation. The footage was so clear, you could read the serial numbers on the pills Bradley was selling. Agent Patterson had nearly choked on her coffee when I showed her the video of Margaret's son running a drive-through pharmaceutical business from federal property. Research HOA leadership's local history. Old grudges often drive present-day harassment. By the end of that week, Margaret had managed to create a federal case file thick enough to use as a doorstop. Drug trafficking on federal property, obstruction of a federal investigation, wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and defamation of a federal assets family member. The woman had basically speed-run her way through the federal criminal code. The trap was set, the evidence was overwhelming, and Margaret was about to walk into a courtroom where her family grudge would meet federal justice. Justice has a funny way of compound interest, and Margaret's bill was about to come due with 40 years of accumulated penalties. The town hall meeting that would end Margaret's reign of terror wasn't even supposed to be about her. Mayor Davidson had called it to discuss the annual 4th of July festival budget, but Margaret had demanded speaking time to address what she called the federal conspiracy threatening our community values. 237 people packed into the community center that Thursday night, the largest turnout in the town's history. Word had spread through social media, veteran networks, and good old-fashioned gossip that something big was going down. The air was thick with anticipation and the smell of burnt coffee from the ancient percolator that someone had dragged out for the occasion. Margaret arrived fashionably late, flanked by her 4 remaining board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. She'd dressed for battle in her most professional suit, carrying a briefcase that probably contained more fraudulent documents and rehearsed talking points. But she hadn't noticed the black SUVs in the parking lot, or the serious-looking people in suits scattered throughout the audience, or the way Daniel Kim was positioned with a perfect view of the podium with his video camera rolling. Mayor Davidson opened the meeting with routine business, but Margaret immediately demanded to speak first. "Mr. Mayor, this community is under attack by a dangerous individual who's using false federal claims to terrorize law-abiding families. The people deserve to know the truth." She approached the podium like she was accepting an award, that familiar smirk playing across her face as she surveyed what she thought was her kingdom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're dealing with an unstable veteran who's been making threats, filing frivolous lawsuits, and now claims to work for the FBI." The crowd murmured, but not in the supportive way Margaret was expecting. She pressed on, pulling out blown-up photos of my grandfather's correspondence. "These so-called FBI documents are obvious forgeries. Everyone knows that Walter Kowalski was a communist sympathizer who probably sold secrets to our enemies." That's when Mrs. Chen stood up in the back row. "Excuse me, but are you saying that a Purple Heart recipient who served this country in Korea was a traitor?" Her voice carried across the room like a bell, and suddenly every veteran in the building was sitting up straighter. Margaret's composure cracked just a little. "I'm saying that just because someone claims military service doesn't mean they're above the law. This man's grandson is using emotional manipulation and fake federal connections to steal property that legally belongs to the Homeowners Association." "Actually," came a voice from the middle of the room, "let me clarify something about those federal connections." Agent Patterson stood up, her FBI credentials clearly visible as she approached the podium. "I'm Special Agent Sarah Patterson, and I worked with Walter Kowalski for 35 years. He was one of the most patriotic Americans I've ever known." The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that worn carpet as Agent Patterson continued. "Mr. Kowalski's property maintains an active federal easement for national security purposes, which means this HOA has exactly zero authority over that land. Furthermore, we've been investigating interference with federal property, and we found some very interesting evidence." Margaret's face had gone from confident pink to panic white. That's not possible. I have documentation proving—" "You have forgeries," Agent Patterson interrupted, her voice carrying the kind of authority that makes generals stand at attention. "We've had your supposed 1987 agreement analyzed by federal document specialists. The paper was manufactured in 2019, the ink is less than 6 months old, and the notary seal belongs to someone who died in 1995. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Margaret actually took a step backward from the podium, but Agent Patterson wasn't finished. "We've also discovered that your son has been using the illegally occupied property to distribute controlled substances, violating both his probation and federal drug trafficking laws. Bradley Thornfield was arrested this afternoon." That's when the federal marshals stood up from their seats, scattered throughout the audience. Margaret looked around wildly, finally realizing she was surrounded. "This is entrapment. This is a setup. You can't do this to me." "Ma'am," said the lead marshal, approaching the podium with handcuffs, "you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, interference with federal property, and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent." As the cuffs clicked into place, Margaret's remaining board members were quietly slipping toward the exits, but Daniel Kim's camera caught everything. Her final words before being led away were, "This isn't over. I'll sue all of you. I know people." Public exposure often triggers law enforcement action that private complaints couldn't achieve. The community erupted in applause as Margaret was escorted out, but the real celebration started when Mayor Davidson announced that the city would be launching a full investigation into HOA oversight and implementing new protections for residents. Frank, from the American Legion, stood up and said what everyone was thinking. "It's about damn time someone stood up to these HOA bullies. Walter Kowalski would be proud." Within 24 hours of Margaret's arrest, I was back in my grandfather's cabin, breathing in the familiar smell of pine logs and lake air instead of the stale cigarette smoke that Bradley and his girlfriend had left behind. The first thing I did was tear down the cheap blackout curtains they'd hung and let the morning sunlight stream across the hardwood floors that my grandfather had laid with his own hands. The federal marshals had been thorough in their eviction of the squatters. Bradley's collection of energy drink cans, stolen shopping cart, and what appeared to be a small pharmacy's worth of pills were all bagged as evidence. His girlfriend had left behind a collection of romance novels and what I can only describe as the world's angriest houseplant, which I decided to keep and nurse back to health. Even criminals deserve redemption, apparently. Margaret's legal troubles were just beginning. Federal prosecutors charged her with fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, and interference with government property. The State Real Estate Commission permanently revoked her license, and the IRS opened an investigation into her unreported income from various property schemes. She was looking at 3 to 5 years in federal prison and restitution payments that would wipe out her savings. Bradley got 6 months in county jail and 2 years of supervised probation, with mandatory drug counseling and community service. His probation officer wasn't taking any chances this time. Weekly check-ins and random drug tests would keep him busy for the foreseeable future. But the real victory was what happened to the community. Within a month, 4 other HOA boards in the county had voluntarily reformed their bylaws to include homeowner protections and financial transparency requirements. The state legislature, prompted by Daniel Kim's investigative series, introduced the Homeowner Protection Act that would prevent future Margaret Thornfields from terrorizing families. I established the Walter Kowalski Memorial Fund with money from a settlement the HOA insurance company was eager to pay to avoid further legal exposure. The fund provides legal assistance to military families facing HOA harassment and offers grants for veteran housing initiatives. It felt like the perfect way to honor my grandfather's memory while ensuring his story would help others. The cabin itself became something my grandfather would have loved, a gathering place for the community he'd served in secret for so many years. Every month we host a veteran support meeting where coffee flows freely and war stories mix with practical advice about dealing with bureaucracy, PTSD, and the challenge of civilian life. Agent Patterson, now officially retired, became a regular visitor. She'd bring FBI colleagues who were interested in the cabin's history, and we'd sit on the dock while she told stories about the operations that had been planned in my grandfather's living room. "This place helped keep America safe," she'd say, watching the sunset reflect off Mirror Lake. "Your grandfather was a true patriot." The annual lakefront cleanup, organized by our new coalition of neighbors, became the biggest community event of the year. Last year, we pulled 3 tons of trash out of the lake and surrounding woods, with volunteers ranging from elementary school kids to World War II veterans. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings, Frank organized the logistics with military precision, and even Mayor Davidson rolled up his sleeves to help. Daniel Kim's investigation won a regional journalism award and led to a book deal for a comprehensive look at HOA corruption across the country. He dedicated a chapter to my grandfather's story, calling it a perfect example of how federal service extends beyond the uniform and continues to protect American families decades later. The property dispute revealed something beautiful about small-town America. When good people band together against bullies, justice usually wins. Margaret had counted on our isolation, our ignorance, and our reluctance to fight back. She didn't count on the bonds that connect military families, the long memory of federal agencies, or the power of neighbors who refuse to stand by while someone gets steamrolled. As I write this, I'm sitting on my grandfather's handmade dock, watching the morning mist rise off Mirror Lake. The coffee tastes better here than anywhere else. The silence is deep enough to think clearly, and every sunset reminds me that some things are worth fighting for. Got your own HOA nightmare story? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one, and some of these tales of bureaucratic insanity are absolutely wild. And if you want to see more stories where the little guy wins against corrupt systems, hit that subscribe button. Because in America, justice might be delayed, but it's never denied.
Thank you for tuning in to HOA Stories, where neighbors stand up against HOA Karens and karma comes a-knocking. If you like this story, hit that like button, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more HOA tales and real-life neighborhood drama each week.